So after playing The Last Guardian and knowing that the remake of Shadow of the Colossus was coming out, I wanted to do some homework on the creator. And I apologize, I'm going to probably jack his name all up. It's Fumito Ueda. And right after I wrapped up The Last Guardian, my wife and I were so blown away by it that I wanted to really kind of dive into the mind behind the creator. I wanted to see where he drew from and how he comes up with his creations. So I started doing some homework online, and it was quite challenging at first because he's obviously Japanese, and a lot of the interviews or any kind of write-ups or videos I came across happened to be in Japanese. So I did some Google translations and whatnot, and did some reading that way, but it didn't ever really come out right or resonate with me because it was being lost in translation. I happened to come across a really good interview that they published the notes and whatnot, and so I wanted to do a video kind of outlining some of the highlights from that article or interview, if you will, which I'll also have the link to it in the description so you can go read it for yourself. But I found it fascinating, and it really kind of gives you the backstory, if you will, to all three of his games, and why they resonate so much with me is because of the way he creates these worlds and what his ultimate goal is, and it kind of dives into that. So without further ado, I'm going to try to read this off as unrobotic as possible, and hopefully you guys will see some of the genius in Ueda that I found, and why I feel like some of his games, if not, they're amongst the greatest games of all time. And that's even for me, like right up there with The Last of Us and some of the other games that you guys know that I love. So far, The Last Guardian is by far, hands down, one of my ultimate all-time favorite games. It blew me away. So hope you guys enjoy. I'm going to skip his earlier years and his high school career and go right in towards the senior year of college. And in Japan, you are required to line up a job and I believe go ahead and get the job before you actually graduate. And he was quite the procrastinator. So what he ended up doing was panicking, and the type of art that he was into, he didn't know if he was going to be able to pay the bills with it. So he was really interested in technology, and computers were on an uprise. You had games back then. They were not like what they were today. And so he wasn't quite sure how that would go, but he thought with, graphic design and editing and that sort of thing, he could take his art and apply it to film. And so he and a couple friends were making short films and that sort of thing, all based on a Commodore Amigo. And the reason why he went with that computer in the first place is because it was less expensive than like a Mac. But the issue was that the Amiga, the Commodore, was an English-based computer, and so he had to get a Japanese to English dictionary and teach himself English in order to navigate the software in itself, which is quite remarkable, and that just goes to show what kind of intellect he is. While he was, becoming more competent in graphics design and editing, that sort of thing, he came across a flyer for a all call for artist put out by Sony. And so he thought, well, what the hell, let's go there. And this is kind of how he was first introduced to Sony. And when he shows up to this, what I would assume is like a stadium or a convention center of sorts, there was several stages that you had to get through and beat out a lot of other people in order to win, as the head artist. And it was a more or less an open art type of artist that they were looking for. So it didn't matter if you were a painter, graphics design, musician, didn't really matter. And so there's several stages. I was going to touch on one or a couple of them, the ones that were most memorable to me anyway. I believe the second stage, there you walk inside of we'll call it convention center, and there is these giant tents, and within those tents there's individual tents. It's like for your own project, your own art project. And so what he did was he created a aged bird cage, if you will, that had he put giant scratches over the top of it. And inside the cage on the floor, he put dirt at the bottom of the cage. And then there was a pile, like he piled up the dirt in the middle in like a mound, like an anthill. And in that mound, he built small motors that were controlled via radio to, I guess I would assume it had flappers on it. And so what would happen is the judges would walk in and they were intrigued by this odd bird cage. And so when they'd go up to get a better look of what was inside of it, he would turn on those little motors and it would kick dirt into their face. Because the idea was that he wanted them to walk away and realize that they had dirt all over their nose and on their clothes. And when they go to wipe it away, they would reflect back on that experience. And so his entire goal was not so much about making something beautiful from an aesthetic standpoint. It was more about how it became beautiful once you realize what had just taken place. And that kind of dives into his games for me anyway, because the story and the presentation of the games in themselves don't necessarily have a narrative that he has put in place for you to figure out. Part of the charm, and I think the genius behind his games, is that you are more or less creating your own experience through his vision. And that is absolutely remarkable. So obviously he gets to the last stage, and the last stage was actually at Sony headquarters, and it was on the top floor on the roof, and there was, nothing but Sony executives up there, and the final contestants were tasked with just wowing the audience, right? Just doing something that wowed the audience above all else. And he and his colleague, a friend of his who he had helped assisted him with the previous challenges, if you will, they were contemplating on what we were going to do. How are we going to do this? What are we going to do? A lot of people were doing dance-offs, or they would sing a song or whatever it was. And so right up until the time they had their name called, they weren't quite sure what they were going to do. And what they ended up doing is just on the fly was they walked up to where the stage was to present their piece, and they just went into a full-blown fist fight. And what actually happened was Ueda was actually knocked out. And so that blew the Sony executives away, and he won the competition. So that's kind of where he first was introduced to Sony, or I should say Sony was introduced to him. From there, he took a job with another tech company. I think it was by the name of Warp. And at some point, I guess after a couple of years of being there, Sony put out an ad saying that they needed somebody that was an expert in the type of programs that he used. And there was virtually nobody else that applied because I guess where they were located, nobody was going to school for it or had learned it. And he had self-taught himself everything. So he showed up, went to the interview and got it. The cool takeaway from this is why I'm pushing you guys to do some extra research, because again, this is just to highlight what I found and what I loved. But if you go in and do your own digging, you might uncover some more radical, cool things that he has accomplished or has put into his games. But back to it. So when he gets hired on and he starts doing his pitch, essentially what happens is he becomes one of the lead devs, and he actually becomes what they call the Yoshida team. And that story in itself is fucking awesome. So I hope this was insightful, and I hope that that kind of gives you puts the fire under your seat, if you will, to go do some digging on him. I'm telling you, this guy is awesome, and it really helps showcase what his games are all about. I'm really looking forward to the Shadow of the Colossus remake. Like I said in my previous video, I never finished that game. I got a little past halfway, and then PlayStation Now ran out, so I haven't ever finished it. So I'm pretty excited. I'm being told that the end of the game is actually just as, if not more powerful than The Last Guardian, and that's I can't even fathom that. So anyway, I hope you guys just enjoyed this, and I look forward to talking to you next time. I also wanted to add that the gentleman who created the Demon Souls / Dark Souls franchise was actually inspired to make video games in the first place because of Ico, which I thought was massively impressive. That's a pretty cool tidbit there for you. Anyways, I'm out.